Hello, everyone. Welcome back after Pesach. Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS. Very happy to see everyone today after a 2-week hiatus from our Monday learning. So welcome back to all those returning, and welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time today for this session in our spring series. It finally is starting to feel like spring around here. The space in between thresholds and borders in Jewish life and thought. So here we are on the threshold of spring. We're so pleased to have, for the first time in a while, Professor Marjorie Lehman teaching us today. Her session is called Defying All Categories, Witches in the Talmud. So we're talking about a class of people who are kind of on the margins or on the outer border of sort of accepted society, and that's where this lives in the context of our series. We don't have any sponsors for today's session, although we do have many coming up, but we would love for all of you to consider sponsoring a session if you're able. We have 3 sponsorship levels at $540, $1,000, and $1,800, and there's information in the chat on how to sponsor. All right, and I turn it over now to Tani Schwartz-Herman.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format of our session, Professor Lehman will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Professor Lehman. Since we receive a large number of questions, we'd just like to ask that you please be as clear as possible with your questions. Please make sure that your question is worded as a complete statement of what you wish to learn. And if your question is in response to a specific source or insight that the scholar has shared, please clearly refer to that source or comment, as we may not get to questions until later on in the session. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The PowerPoint presentation for today's class was in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing it as well, and we'll also share a link shortly in the chat. So pleased to introduce Dr. Marjorie Lehman, Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS, and the Area Coordinator of Rabbinic Literatures and Cultures. She is the author of 2 books, The Ein Yaakov, Jacob Ibn Habib's Search for Faith in the Talmudic Corpus, and most recently, Bringing Down the Temple House, Engendering Tractate Yoma. Dr. Lehman has also co-edited 2 books, Mothers in the Jewish Cultural Imagination, and Learning to Read Talmud, What It Looks Like and How It Happens. Dr. Lehman is co-editor of an internationally renowned digital humanities project in Jewish studies called Footprints, Jewish Books in Time and Place, which tracks and analyzes the global movement of copies of Jewish books since the inception of print. We're so pleased to have Dr. Lehman teaching us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lehman.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. First, just a thank you to Rabbi Andelman, Tani Herman Schwartz, and Ellie Gettinger for all of their organization, and of course to JTS for enabling me to teach a course last fall called Harlots, Witches, and Priests. It was an undergraduate class in which it was a personal interest of mine and a thought that maybe our undergraduates would be more attracted to a course in Talmud if somehow witches and harlots formed part of that, that course. And so I want to thank JTS for allowing me to workshop some of this material, and I'm anxious to hear some of your thoughts on this very complex, what I think is a very complex agadic story. I also want to just say that while witchery and witches definitely form a theme in this piece and in this learning today, what I want you to also remember is that what I'm trying to do here is to also introduce you to reading Talmudic literature, and that any good literature, when it presents its characters, very often presents those characters as very complicated figures. figures that live very messy lives rather than figures who fit into very well-structured binaries of good and bad. And so I want to move through the text with you, not only to talk about witches or witchery, but also to talk about the ways we read these texts. And for that reason, I'm actually going to narrate or read the text relatively quickly once through with you all first before I go through it step by step. So I think that there's some value in each of you sort of hearing the overview of the story and to jotting down some of your impressions about that story on a first read. And then, like we do in our JTS classes, we go back and we really tear the texts apart and look at them in depth. And so that's what I want to do on the second read. It will also be the case that in the end, I will be able to share with you a manuscript. It happens that this story appears in another version in earlier manuscripts, and I will be able to share with you, therefore, two slightly different endings to this story. But I'm going to share with you the one that's traditionally most known. I'll read through it. After I read through it the first time, and you have the PowerPoint in the chat, so you could open it up, you can look at it. I will take a few clarification type questions early on from those of you who would like some clarification or have a comment or some questions about the first reading. And then I will move forward in terms of contextualizing it more deeply. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint now. Sorry. I'm hoping that you all can see it.
We see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so to start out with, I just want to say that in one of the reasons why I was sort of brought to this interest in witches is because in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of the Trumpian years, we've seen a rise in interest in witchery, witchcraft, people aligning themselves with Wiccan groups, covens. And so that sort of drew my attention. It has always been the case that there has been witchcraft or people associated with witchcraft. This is nothing new for the times, but there has been an uptick of late. And often the proliferation of witchcraft reflects two timeless and universal urges: the need to draw meaning from chaos and the desire to control the circumstances around us. So given a pandemic where, as we all know, coming now toward hopefully what is the end of it, those feelings of chaos and of loneliness and of not being sure of where we're headed certainly brought, I think, the proliferation of interest in witchcraft to the surface. Now, here's the story. This is a story that appears in the Babylonian Talmud. It's a story that appears, oddly enough, in, well, maybe not so oddly enough, we'll see what you think, in a tractate called Tractate Gittin. Gittin is the tractate that deals mostly with divorce. And it also appears in the context of a conversation about captivity and about women being taken captive. It was a pronounced situation in antiquity that women and others, not only women, but men as well, were taken captive. Very often women, because they could be used for servants, servitude, as well as obviously in harem-like contexts, one could argue. So it wasn't an unusual thing for antiquity for there to have been people being taken captive, and the Talmud deals with the issues of captivity quite extensively. Ransom, how much you have to spend, who's responsible for ransoming. And as you know, the issue of captives is one that remains on the table even today. So I'm going to share this story with you. Its central figure, or at least as it begins, figures are the daughters of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is a very famous, prominent Babylonian rabbi, and it begins this way. So I'm going to read through it. You can follow me through, and then again, don't worry if you're missing details. I'm going to go through it more slowly the second time around. Rav Nachman's daughters would stir a pot with their hands. Rav Elish had a difficulty with a verse. As it is written, one human being out of 1,000 I found, and a woman out of all I did not find. So in the context in Ecclesiastes or in Kohelet, they're talking there about the fact that most human beings or all human beings are wonderful, wise, but of those human beings, of course, women are excluded. And so it's kind of a disparaging point being made about women. And so Rav Elish then comes in and says, what about Rav Nachman's daughters? These words, meaning what about Rav Nachman's daughters, kind of indicating that in fact, there was something special about Rav Nachman's daughters. And in fact, they may have actually represented the other side of this verse, which that they were righteous. So what about Rav Nachman's daughters? These words caused them to be taken captive, okay? Because obviously he drew attention to them and drew attention to the fact that they would stir pots with their hands. We don't really know what that means, but he drew attention to them and they were taken captive. And Rav Elish was also taken captive with them. One day, a certain man was sitting with him who knew the language of birds. A raven came and called to Rav Elish. Rav Elish said to the man, "What is the raven saying?" And he said to him that it is saying the following, "Elish, escape, Elish, escape." And Rav Elish said, "It is a lying raven. I do not rely on it." In the meantime, a dove came and was calling out. And Rav Elish said to the man, "Tell me, what's it saying?" And he said to him, the dove said, "Elish, escape, Elish, escape." And Elish said, "The congregation of Israel is compared to a dove. I conclude from the dove's words that a miracle will happen." And Rav Elish said, "I will go and I will see Rav Nachman's daughters." If they remain faithful, I will return them. So meaning I will escape, I will take them with me, and we will escape from these captors. He said, women tell all of their matters to each other in the bathroom. So he has to figure out for some reason whether these women are still faithful to God. And so he says, look, I'm going to go to the bathhouses or to the bathrooms, and which were of course outside in those days. And that's where women gossip. That's where women talk to each other. And he heard these women saying to each other, these captives, these captors, these people who have captured us now are our husbands. And the men who we left in Nehardia, which is a city in Babylonia, those men of Nehardia were our husbands, meaning they're trying to say that now the people who are their captors are their new husbands, and the men of Nehardia are the husbands that they left in Nehardia. We should tell our captors to distance us from here so that our husbands should not come and here and redeem us and take us home. Meaning they want to stay in captivity. They don't want to go home. Rav Elish arose and escaped. So Rav Elish goes and he escapes himself. He and that man, meaning the man who was speaking to the birds, came to a river crossing, and a miracle happened for him, and he crossed the river on a ferry, and the captors found that man, meaning man who could speak to the birds, who knew the language of the birds, and they killed him. And when the daughters returned, and they came back home, and we don't know how they got back home. He said, we don't know who the he is, but we think it's Rav Elish, but maybe it's Rav Nachman. Basically, what did they say about these women? They would stir the pot with witchcraft or sorcery. So they start out at the beginning as women who stir a pot with their hands. We're not sure what that means, but Rav Elish interprets it and takes it as something positive about them. And then they end up being labeled as they would stir the pot with witchcraft, meaning the verse was correct. There aren't righteous women. And Rav Elish was then taught the lesson of these women who basically now the reason why they could put their hands into a pot and stir was because they were sorceresses of some sort. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. Now that story has a lot of details and a lot of confusing pieces. I get that. And I'm going to re-narrate it in the context of witchery in a minute. But I want to take some questions. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to hear if you have any sort of questions that you have of clarification or comments that you want to make already about what's going on in this story. So maybe 2 or 3 comments or so, if anyone has them. And I'm going to stop my share. Okay.
So as Dr. Lehman said, this is the time for clarification questions. And I will just, for anyone who found it difficult to follow how each piece fit with the piece before it, I validate you, and it's a tricky story. So I'm very glad that you're going to be going through it closely. Okay, we don't really have clarification questions, although a few people commented about, and I was thinking the same thing, how nothing has changed in terms of where women go to, chat when they're out. Okay, someone asked if there's particular symbolism to the raven. That was one question.
Okay, so particular symbolism of the raven and the dove should conjure up Noah, the Noah story. And if you remember, Noah sends out a raven first, but it's the dove that comes back with the olive branch. And the raven is kind of more sinister type of bird, kind of a symbol where the waters have not yet receded. It's not safe enough to go out. Whereas the dove that comes back with the olive branch is obviously the sign that the flood is over and it's time for growth and future. And so doves are generally symbolic of something very positive. And that's why Rav Elish reads the dove as a positive symbol that a miracle will happen. So it's a good pickup. Yeah, that's a good point.
Someone asked, understanding bird language is not considered witchcraft?
Okay, so that's right. So if you're a person who can understand bird language, then yes, there is something akin to sorcery or something magical about that. Absolutely. And I do think that when you are venturing down the road of witchcraft, it's usually about somebody who believes they can break the law of nature, and the law of nature being that a bird could speak to a man and a man could translate what that bird was saying is clearly in that realm of sorcery or magic. And we need to remember that because we're going to compare that to these women who are then labeled as sorceresses at the end. So again, we want to keep each character in the story separate because each character is going to come with themselves or bear a certain degree of ambiguity and messiness. Whereas this man who is talking to the birds, I think we can see him in a quietly different character light. So we're going to get back to that. Okay, great.
And there was another question about this understander of birds. But we're gonna, it sounds like, spend more time on him. So okay. So maybe we can just close this Q&A portion. I'll just read a comment that one person wrote. So many familiar tropes about witches from across the ages and cultures: sexual power, a life outside of men, being able to defy nature. In this case, stirring a boiling hot pot with one's hands. And I'm just reminded, Dr. Lehman, of, just all the ways in which the rabbis, just as a product of their times, had so little understanding of women's bodies, right? They didn't understand they didn't understand the reproductive cycle. So why are these people randomly bleeding once a month? Bleeding is bad. Bleeding means there's something wrong, but not for them. So there's something crazy going on, right? Like there was so much that they just didn't understand, and so much sort of almost inevitable othering, I guess, that comes from a product of those times. But you're taking us into kind of an extreme case of that, I'm sure.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. But anyway, thank you for that comment, and thank you for all the comments. They're really helpful. I'm going to now share my screen again, and hopefully get us back to the same place. Okay. And now, okay, so I basically just put a list here of some of the questions that occurred to me in a first read, some of the questions that I'm hoping, and please feel free to just jot down questions for yourselves along the way. You can either put them in the chat, or you can also, I'm going to be happy, afterward, if you have, you want to email me, I'm always happy to answer questions afterward. But here were some of the questions that were kind of disturbing or bothering me. So why do we learn only one detail about these daughters, that they're stirring pots? Okay, so that to me was a little bit, what are we getting from that? Of all the things we need to learn about Rav Nachman's daughters, he's a pretty famous rabbi. That's the one piece that they're sharing with us. So why that? Do these daughters live together? Are they in some kind of household where all the daughters are together and so they can be taken captive together? It seems like they all do the same thing. That was a little bit odd. Are they married? Do they have children? It looks like from the source that they are referring back to husbands, but it's kind of unclear whether they have children. It's also not clear whether they're learned in any way. What kind of relationship do they have with Rav Nachman? But why doesn't Rav Nachman react? And he's the one who raises the money for ransom. I mean, this is in the context of a legal discussion about how one pays for someone who's taken captive. So where's Rav Nachman? He kind of falls out of the story. The biggest problem I have is this Rav Elish, because who is he? He all of a sudden is taken captive with these women, and he watches what they do. He watches them cooking, but he's not related to them. Is he part of the household? Is he part of the house of study? Does he have some relationship with Rav Nachman? And he's not a commonly known rabbi. Like if you look him up, you can Google Rav Nachman and you'll get all sorts of information about him. Rav Elish, pretty much nothing. So he's a very minor rabbinic character. And so this issue of the relationship between this rabbi and these women is really weird. And also that he kind of leaves them, to fend for themselves. I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me. And that he trusts this man who has, talks to the birds. And who's this man who talks to the birds? So there's a lot of questions that are certainly percolating. Now, just to talk about a little context on witchcraft and the Jewish tradition. So while I'd like to say it's very clear cut, and that in fact, Judaism and witchcraft don't go together at all. Meaning if you are a witch and you perform witchcraft, whether you are a man or a woman, and this is not gendered because you could be a man who performs magic, just like the man who talks to the birds, you get a penalty. If you look in Leviticus, you get a penalty of death, of stoning. So the Bible is pretty clear that we don't tolerate, and if you look even the words in Hebrew there, mechashefa lo tichayeh, the word chai, like we don't allow sorceresses life. We don't want them to be part of our communities. And so there's a pretty strong biblical tendency toward no witchcraft. And yet, of course, there are places in the Bible where, certainly sorceress or witchcraft type of sorcery occurs. So on the one hand, it looks like biblically it's a no-no. However, I don't want to say to you that Talmudically it's absent, because it's not. And there are plenty of people and plenty of references, at least in rabbinic literature, of people worried about demons, trying to create spells that will protect them from demons, who are nervous about certain people in their environs who perform witchcraft, some of whom they believe deserve a death penalty, but some of whom they don't. And some are men and some are women. Now, here is just one example of a Mishnah it's an early source, a rabbinic source in Tractate Sanhedrin. And very quickly, I'm just going to kind of give you a little background on witchcraft, or the attitude toward the performance of witchcraft in Talmudic literature. Rabbi Akiva said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, there is a case of two people gathering cucumbers. So for some reason, this gathering cucumbers thing was considered a potentially example of somebody who would be performing sorcery. One who gathers is exempt, and one who gathers is liable for stoning. Meaning there's one who does the sorcery, and when they use the cucumbers for any kind of witchcraft, they are liable for stoning. And then there's the one that grabs the eye, and that person is exempt from any punishment. So there's something about, sometimes people are performing certain spells, or it looks like a spell, or it looks like an illusion of some sort. And if you can't prove that it's actual sorcery, that person does not get stoned. And so there were, this is where we get into this middle zone of, define for me what you really think is actual witchcraft. What is a true definition in which the person deserves to be completely stoned for what it is they've done? And the rabbis are well aware of the fact that there are people who actually believe in certain kinds of spells or rituals that can actually change or keep demons away or invite demons. And they don't necessarily want them. They don't want to, they don't have they don't totally disbelieve them, is what I'm trying to say. And so, there's kind of like this middle zone where the rabbis are not entirely anti-sorcery. So it's a complicated position. Okay, so now I'm going to go and I'm going to retell this story. We're going to read through it again together a little bit more slowly, so that we can get a bit more of the background. So now we're starting over again. The daughters of Rav Nachman would stir a pot with their hands. Now, what does that mean, that they stir a pot with their hands? So assuming that they're sticking their hands in boiling hot water and they are able to withstand that heat, and that makes them, somehow people notice that about them. It makes them distinct in some way. I don't know that it makes them a witch per se, but it's definitely drawing the attention of people around them. What Rashi, who's a medieval commentary, says on that, stir the pot with their hands. Rashi says, Rav Nachman's daughters would actually hold the sides of the pot with their hands while it was boiling. And the person who was observing this would see that the heat was not bothering them, and so would consider them as tzadkaniyot, or righteous ones. So meaning they could do something that was really special. And so that actually was an indicator of their righteousness, because they could do something that nobody else could. And so it's not necessarily a sign of something bad or something, problematic, but rather an indication of something actually, an indication of something quite extraordinary, is what I want to say. Now, I just have to say as an aside, and I can say that this is a true experience that I've had, where I was in the kitchen with my mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law's hand, she doesn't have pot holders. She doesn't use pot holders. And she asked me to go over to her oven, and she said, can you take out that roast or whatever from the oven? So I said, where are your pot holders? I don't use them. I don't have them. And I'm thinking, what? How do you do that? She says, oh, I take a dish towel and I grab the pot on the sides with the dish towel and I take it out. And I'm like, no, it's going to go right through to your hands and I'm going to get burned. This is just not going to work. So she says, okay, I'm going to do it. And she goes in, she takes it out. the bottom line is that she never got burned because her hands were so callous, I think, because she was so accustomed and so used to touching things that were really extraordinarily hot that it didn't bother her. And she was able to do that. And so I do think that there are certain people who cook a lot, and maybe these women were those people who were cooking a lot, and the cooking was done in public because it was usually done not in the house necessarily, but in a kind of like probably in the courtyard. And so people could view them. And I think they probably did it so much that they could actually touch these pots with their hands. And it may have not been anything as extraordinary as this Agadic passage relates. But anyway, so here we have these women, and Rav Elish says, okay, we have this verse from Kohelet, and the verse from Kohelet says, one human being out of 1,000 I found, and a woman out of all of them I did not find. If you look on the right-hand side, you will see the context of Kohelet there. They're talking about people who have wisdom and study, and people who are wicked and exhibit folly. And the fact is that they end up by saying men are, the great wise human beings, but women, on the other hand, we cannot find those wise, great women. And then Rav Elish comes in and says, what about the daughters of Rav Nachman? Because he's viewing them and he sees that these women are doing something extraordinary. And maybe what he's seeing in them is the fact that they touch the sides, maybe they put their hands into the pot, or maybe they're just great housewives. Maybe they're really just taking really amazing care of their households and the people who live with them. And Rav Elish recognizes that and believes that that's some kind of righteous behavior. It's totally unclear. In the next piece, these words of Rav Elish caused the daughters to be taken captive. And like I told you, very common captivity in antiquity, it occurred. And he, Rav Elish, was also taken captive with him. And here's my big question. Why is Rav Elish being taken captive with them? Who is he and what's going on? I'd like the Agadah to say that he was their protector, or he was so worried about them, or Rav Nachman, their father, was so worried about them being taken into captivity, he sent his student, Rav Elish, to watch over them. I would have liked some detail, which I get none. Instead, the next scene is Rav Elish talking to birds. Well, he's not talking to birds. He's talking to a man who talks to birds. He's sitting with this man and they're having a conversation. And I'm going to read it to you again. One day, a man was sitting with him, Rav Elish, who knew the language of birds, presumably looks like some kind of person who has extraordinary supernatural powers of some, that breaks the natural order. A raven came and called to him. He, Rav Elish, said to him, so this is, Rav Elish says to the person who could understand the birds, what's the raven saying? And he said, the raven is saying, Elish, you got to get out of here. You got to leave. And Rav Elish says, no, ravens are sinister and lying, and I don't believe a word you're saying. And so what you have here is Rav Elish acting like a rabbi. What do rabbis do? They interpret sources. And so here you have Rav Elish sort of functioning like a rabbi who's reading the tea leaves, like he's reading the language of this man who's reading the language of the birds. And he has decided that because it's a raven speaking it, he's not going to believe it. He only believes the same words when it comes from the dove. And in the meanwhile, a dove comes, calls out to him. Rav Elish says, what is the dove saying? The dove is saying, you got to get out of here. You got to escape. And Rav Elish says, yes, I'm going to believe the dove. Why am I going to believe the dove? Because the dove is symbolic of miracles. And I know that if this dove is going to tell me to escape, I better get myself organized to escape. So if he's going to get himself organized to escape, then he should have, the next scene in this should be, I'm going to get these women out of here. I'm going to go. I better go get them. And instead, what does he do? He says, you know what? I better see if these women who were taken captive, these daughters of Rav Nachman, remain faithful. I better check it out and see if in fact they still believe in God. But in part, I think he's also wondering, which is what rabbis spend a lot of time in the Talmud worried about, is when women are taken captive, they're very scared that they are raped. And the problem with rape is that means that is considered for the rabbis as a form of adultery. And so the question then became, could they go back to their husbands? Because adultery is considered, if a woman commits adultery, it's over, her marriage is over. And so by and large, the Talmudic passages make the argument that in fact, yes, she goes back to her husband, unless he's a Kohen, but she goes back to her husband and resumes her marriage, because of course, it wasn't something in her control. So right here, we see that Rav Elish is sort of wondering about these women, like what behaviors did they take on? Did they become, or did they remain steadfast and committed to Jewish tradition, to God, to their husbands? What happened? Instead of just getting them out of there. So it's problematic. And then Rav Elish says, you know what? This is the way I'm going to check it all out. I'm going to go to the bathhouse. And also, by the way, so the bathhouses and the bathrooms, whatever, were also outside of the houses, so you did have women probably congregating, even in antiquity, in front of a bathhouse or a bathroom. And that's where they would gossip, or they would, maybe not even gossip, they would talk to each other. It is absolutely like, it is rare in Talmudic literature to find women talking to each other. There's so few sources where we find women gathered together and talking to each other. And here's one of them. And they're talking to each other. And what do they say? That he heard them saying, these captors are our husbands now, meaning like we've had sexual relations with them. So that basically means that we're essentially married to them. And those Nehardian Jews, meaning our Jewish husbands, they're still our husbands back home. So now we have these two husbands. And let us say to our captives that we want them to distance us from here. Like, we don't want our husbands to be able to find us. We don't want our husbands to come and redeem us. We want to stay where we are. We want to stay with these captors. So I don't exactly know what's going on here, but it seems to be a case where, and it might have happened, that if a woman was in any kind of abusive marriage, how did she get out of it? Well, she could commit adultery with a man and then her marriage would be over. Of course, then she'd have to use the sin of adultery in order to do that, but she didn't have many options. And so in this case, she's taken captive, and maybe her option is it's better for her to stay in captivity than for them to go back to their husband. So it's a pretty extraordinary case. And by the way, rabbis or editors of the Talmud are picking and choosing all the time what they want to preserve. And the fact that they preserve this is really extraordinary. So they're basically saying, okay, we don't want to go back. And Rav Elish goes and leaves them, which I also find extraordinary. He leaves them. And then, he escapes. And then he goes out, but he leaves with the man who spoke to the birds. So that's sort of interesting. And a miracle occurs because the dove had promised that a miracle was going to occur. A miracle occurs, and Rav Elish is able to cross the river safely, get back to, I guess, Rav Nachman's household, or to Nehardia, where he was from. And the man who speaks the language of the birds, they find him, meaning the captors find him and they kill him. So oddly enough, the man who is really the one who clearly represents witchery here, who really is doing some kind of sorcery or really has some ability to change the natural order of things, that's the person who dies in this story. That's the person who gets killed or somewhat like stoned. That's who it ends for. And by the way, he's not a rabbi, and he's not a captor, and he's not a captive. And there's something very like clear cut about him in some way that isn't quite as clear cut about some of the other characters. Like, I have a lot of questions about Rav Elish's character. I have a lot of questions about these daughters' characters. I have a lot of questions about Rav Nachman and what he was doing. I have a lot of questions about them. But this man who speaks to the birds, I don't have any questions about him. He spoke to the birds and he relayed the story back to Rav Elish, and it happened to be true, and Rav Elish was able to escape. But because he did it through witchcraft or through some kind of magical way, he's the one who winds up dead in the end. And then what happens, and this is the kind of the hardest part of the story, I think, because we have various different versions of it, but the daughters, when the daughters returned, okay, so basically the Hebrew says, I'm sorry, it's Aramaic, when the daughters returned, so when the daughters returned, did they return themselves? Meaning, did they leave these captors and return themselves? Are they ransomed? Which is what a lot of English translations say when the daughters were returned in the passive voice, because they're assuming that, of course, they had to be ransomed, but the actual Aramaic is in active, not passive. So it looks kind of like they came back on their own, but I don't really know the answer to that question. When the daughters returned and came back, he said, meaning who? Who said? Rav Elish said? Rav Nachman said? Not clear, but let's say hypothetically it's Rav Elish. He says they would stir the pot with witchcraft, meaning what did he learn? He learned that in fact, these women were not such great women. They weren't totally faithful, that when they were taken captive, they weren't upstanding citizens, and therefore they were not tzidkaniot, they were not righteous women. And so what should we do? We call them witches, right? In other words, he said, he called them. He was the one who labeled them as witches. Because basically, what do you do with women who you don't know how to slot into a category? What do you do about women who you can't figure out what it is that they are doing? Or maybe they've taken matters into their own hands and started to live more freely? Well, that is a very scary idea. And so what do? Label them as witches. And so therefore it kind of discredits them on some level. But interestingly enough, and the Talmud, I mean, as it is that human beings, obviously, when they're copying things over, when you copy over a manuscript, sometimes you actually change the meaning as to what it is you think it should mean. Sometimes you have several manuscripts that you're copying at once and you choose the best version. Sometimes you make a mistake, but we happen to be very fortunate today where you can go online and you can find all the different manuscripts available of the Babylonian Talmud. And so this morning I was able to come across one due to a colleague of mine, Aaron Kohler, who helped me to with this. And it basically does not say, it leaves out the words he said. And therefore it ends, when the daughters returned, they would stir the pot with sorcery. Meaning when they returned, they were either angry or they were, in fact, had achieved some kind of ability to cast spells, or maybe they wanted to cast spells. And so they were upset by the situation in which they had returned to. And so they basically, kind of claim witchery for themselves. And so they perform some type of acts that we might label as sorcery on some level, but it's because, in fact, not because they're just unrighteous per se, but maybe because they're just unhappy in this situation of having to return, which would, of course, leave us to believe that someone ransomed them and they were forced to return. Their captives wanted the money, and then, they were forced to return home. So those are two different readings. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop here before I now put another kind of layer onto this discussion of this story. I'm going to stop here for some questions, either clarification or comments about what you think is going on. We'll stop for, I don't know, a few minutes, and then I'm going to stop my share, and I'm happy to field some questions for a few minutes.
Okay, now I have about 10,000 questions. So I've been trying to organize them. So we'll see what we get to now, and hopefully we'll get to more later. So a whole bunch of questions related to stirring.
Well, I'll just say, Julia, that we will have a little time at the end to, I'll leave some time at the end to go back to questions, and so don't worry. All right,
Great.
go for it.
Okay. So a lot of questions and comments about stirring, the stirring of the pots. Many people made a connection to Macbeth, and one person asked, are these pots related to, or perhaps this is the subject of speculation, but are they related to incantation bowls in their literary historical context? And a few other people commented on various medical conditions that impact, can impact a person's sense of touch. So that's sort of another thing that could be going on with them that would have nothing to do with witchcraft, and a whole lot of other questions about the stirring of the pots, but let's stick with.
Okay, so those are amazing questions. I especially love the one about it being an incantation bowl, presumably. I love that point. So just to catch everybody up to that, it so happens that we have found in archaeological evidence bowls that actually have in Hebrew either prayers or spells, or and we believe that the bowls were used by Jews to affect magical experiences. And so there's a lot of interest today. We're actually at JTS trying to get a course taught about it next year, but there's a lot of interest in those bowls. So I don't think that's what we're talking about here, although it's possible. I don't know. To me, it feels like these are daughters who happen to live in a larger household where they're going about their daily actions of stirring pots, and they can hold the sides or whatever, or they do cook with their hands when they can't grab a utensil. They didn't have as many utensils as we do today, and so I think that they could have become desensitized to the heat, and just been dutiful women who were doing what they were supposed to do in their roles as wives. But again, I don't know. And it is highly possible that what we're talking about here is they begin the story as witches, meaning they're using these incantation bowls. Maybe they were healers of some sort. And Rav Elish saw them and thought that was actually extraordinary about them, is that they had this ability to kind of use these pots to prepare medicinal something or other to heal people or to change, the supernatural way of the world, and that they were casting spells. And so that was something that was extraordinary to him, and that was why they were taken captive. So that's highly possible. But in my mind, I'm not sure that that's what's going on again, but I don't know. So it's a great point. I also think there's daughters. And so that's another issue too, which is I don't think that you have somebody who has a medical condition that desensitizes one to heat, or they all have the same medical condition. I really think it's true that if you cook in a certain way, just like if, people can their feet, they can walk on hot rocks if they're, they gain calluses all over the bottoms of their feet. I think it's possible. So anyway, I don't know.
Okay, fascinating and great. I forgot to note also that many people made the connection between stirring the pot and gossip, and that that image of the women talking in the bathroom,
right,
then and now. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit. So a lot of questions about the implications of the women being in captivity and how they're being characterized. So first, to kind of state the obvious, as in the Torah, we're sort of eliding rape and adultery here, which, right, in the Torah already tells us if a woman is taken captive, she can't go back to her husband because, as you said, it's assumed that she's been raped. But Rav Elish is describing that here as being unfaithful to their husbands. So that seems like an important thing to.
I don't know that he's describing it as them being unfaithful to their husbands. I added them in. He's just in the Hebrew Aramaic there. He's just going to see if they are faithful or steadfast in their faith. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know whether it's faithful, meaning faithful to their husband or faithful to God.
Pious.
So it's hard. That's another one that's hard to understand, but in a context of witchery where you might actually, pagan, it sort of brings up these kind of pagan leanings. So if you're living in a non-Israelite, non-Jewish circumstance, maybe you picked up on some of their processes, some of their rituals that are, pagan. So again, it's unclear, but anyway, go on.
Okay, so that's a very helpful clarification. So people are also, kind of thinking about the various motivations the women could have for what Rabbi Elish hears them saying. Maybe they're trying to avoid public shame either for themselves, or for their husbands and families. There's one person also suggested that sort of the story as a whole, maybe it's kind of a creative way of allowing these women back into the community. Like witchcraft is better than, the adultery / rape situation. So kind of some positive spins on what's happening here in terms of the motivations of the women and how they're the witchcraft as kind of a device in the story.
Right. I actually want to get back to that. I'm going to hold on to that piece because that I want to circle back to that in the kind of like last third of this talk and sort of bring that up as to what this could possibly mean. And just because they're labeled as sorceresses or witches, is that necessarily negative? Because I think we tend to put things into this kind of like positive, negative binary, and it's not that clear. But anyway, so I want to get back to that.
Okay, great. Okay, so maybe just segueing from that, a lot of people ask in different ways, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, sort of the fine line between, miracles and special powers good, and magic and sorcery bad, maybe bad. Or you were just saying it's not so simple, but people were giving examples of the Witch of Endor and Choni, who draws the circle to bring around himself to bring rain. People are also bringing many examples of folks who talk to or understand birds, including King Solomon, who tradition considers him to be the author of the Book of Kohelet, which came up here. So a lot of people, sort of boiled that down to, what's the difference between the good stuff and the bad stuff? Is it just about gender, basically?
It's definitely not just about gender. I think in this particular story, in this particular story, actually, the women come out better than the man who's talking to the birds. So there is something gendered in that regard, but I don't think that it's all a gendered piece. I think I want to just back up, and I want to just say that this is what makes the study of magic, sorcery, witchcraft complicated. So if I'm a big davener, like I pray all the time and I pray a lot, and one of the reasons why I go and I pray is because I really believe that when I pray, I'm going to bring goodness and healing to someone I know is sick, let's say, and then that person gets better. And so I assume that through my prayers, I've changed something, and that my prayers sort of worked. So is that a form of, like, what is that exactly? And is that a form of magic in some ways? And is that something that I can believe in? And according Jewishly, I can believe that. So it becomes really complicated. And I think what the distinction I draw is that when we all do the same rituals all the time, so we're all praying the same way, and so we use the same prayer in order to help somebody become healed, and I think that's less what we would consider witchcraft, as people who, as individuals, create their own spells and their own kinds of rituals that are unique to themselves, and use those to say, okay, I'm going to change something about a situation. So I think that it's murky, but I think that we can draw some distinctions. But for the rabbis themselves, you have to imagine that in their world, they didn't want to completely discount the fact that magic could work, or that some kind of sorcery could work. And they didn't want to discount the fact that there could be demons who are responsible for some bad things that happen to them, because then it removes it from God. It's not God who did it, it's the demons. So it's complicated. Anyway, I hope that helps, but.
Yeah. Well, do you want to go back to the material, and then we'll reserve the rest of the questions for the end?
I do. Okay. So I'm going back. Okay, I gotta share here. Okay. Okay, so as I said, my readings about witchcraft of late brought me to an article in The Atlantic by Bianca Bosker, who writes about the fact that witchcraft is on the rise. And I took some of these thoughts from her, and I want to sort of share them with you, because I think what this does is it helps us to understand two different endings to the story. One is that these women are labeled by the story as witches or performing witchcraft when they, put their hands into the pot, so to speak, and to stir the pot. And one in which they themselves, of their own free will, may have taken on witchery for, I don't know, whatever reasons, they decide to take it on. So basically, I'm going to read through the slide, and just because I want to make sure that you can see it from two different perspectives. So throughout history, attempts to control women have masqueraded as crackdowns on witchcraft. In our case, turning women into witches. So basically, I think that they don't start out in the story as witches, but then they become labeled at the end as witches. And so I want you to kind of like think about that move in the text. And that's kind of the move that on some level degrades these women and makes them more dangerous and women that the rabbis want to fear. It's always been about the outsider, about the woman who doesn't do what the church or the patriarchy wants. And so if these women are doing something that the rabbinic elite are not happy with, it may make sense for them to want to label them or other them into this category of witches. Of some sort. Okay, so that is a common, and you've all sort of said this in a lot of your comments, that that's a common thing that happens. And in fact, it happens, I'm just bringing here the example from Salem. So I happen to love, Salem stands out in my mind in a very profound way. It's in Massachusetts. I've taken my kids there, and in preparation for this course on witches, I read a lot about the Salem witch trials. And that was another case in which things were running amok and life was becoming more turbulent. The church really, some of these pastors at the time in Massachusetts really wanted to take control of the community. And so women were being accused of being these horrible, horrible witches. And they were causing really horrible things to happen to others. And that resulted, of course, in them being hung. So, the Salem episode begins modestly enough with 4 afflicted girls, but soon, and within 6 weeks, the acquisitions start to quadruple and people start to get targeted over and over again. Here's just one awful picture of these men who, and you can see the woman here as depicted in such a negative, disgusting way as like looking like a hag or something. So, again, it was a mechanism of control. And today's visitors to Salem, and I include myself in this, having questioned my sons recently about being in Salem, they know that people were executed there for witchcraft in 1692. They may come away without knowing that the 19 people convicted and executed on Gallows Hill were not in fact worshiping the devil and casting spells, and that they were later declared innocent. But because of the continuing lack of clarity about the innocence or guilt of Salem's witches, the belief that there was witchcraft in Salem persists. And so there's like this draw to Salem as being like the place where witchcraft resides. And that's, kind of an unfortunate, kind of end of the story. But there too, we know this for a fact that women very often were turned into, that was a sort of a mechanism of trying to control what was fearful and ambiguous. If women were a little different in some way, well, you would label them and, convict them practically of crimes, which they didn't deserve. Now I want to just go back to the other side, the flip side of the story. There are some people that want to self-identify as a witch. So now we're not talking about somebody who's labeling them from the outside. There are other people who want to self-identify because it's a symbol of a strong female power, especially in the case where if somebody's facing violent or misogynistic type of backlash, it's a form of activism. For many, the witch is worrisome or even crazy, but for those who self-identify, it's kind of freeing. It's a form of individualism. It's my way of saying, I don't really belong in your community and I don't want to do the rituals like you do. I want to do my own sets of rituals. I want to be freed from the structures and the frameworks in which you are forcing me into, and I want to be my own person. And the witch belongs to no one, right? Now, yes, it's true that there are, sort of covens or there are kind of Wiccan, but by and large, witches go by their own rules. There's no one who defines it for them. They live beyond family, beyond community, and that's freeing for some. And so it's not actually the case in the end that women who are women or men who decide to claim themselves as witches are necessarily unrighteous or bad. As you see, these women in the end, they survive, they live, they go back home. They're a surviving group. And so on some level, I'd like to believe that this was granting or almost acknowledging the fact that there were some women who actually had individual powers that the rabbis recognized, and whether or not they used them for bad or good, I don't know. And maybe they used, in this case, these women in the end, maybe they conjured up some witchcraft in order to get back at their husbands in some way. But maybe the rabbis here were recognizing it's not necessarily that we want to call them righteous. We just want to call them different. We want to call them individuals who act differently because they want to be individuals and different and separate from the typical rabbinic wife. And so I appreciate the manuscript reading of the story, which is that they come back and in fact, they act as witches, but they're not stoned. Like they're not killed like the man who speaks to the birds. They actually go back to their homes with their husbands. So I don't know. So I take some comfort in that. And I think that it's a problem for us when we read source material. We read sources. I'm sorry, I'm just going to get to my last slide. I think it's a problem when we read source material in such a way that, or rabbinic source material, and we're already looking to stick the characters into these very rigid frameworks, as if to understand that the reason for why they may have wanted to label these women as witches in the end was profoundly negative. It may be that they were recognizing something in them that was absolutely distinct and that they themselves really were trying to become something other or better or to defy the categories in which they were being placed. The fact that we have the story is pretty extraordinary. And the fact that, it's up to us to read it in ways that open up the conversation as to what we all can possibly be in terms of the way we define who we are. I think that most good literature generates images of people who are more messy and are hard to place into very carefully well-defined boxes. And until we can recognize difference as something potentially positive, at least give them the, I should say, give people the benefit of the doubt to be different. I'm not sure. To me, that's where this story is taking me. Let's put it that way. I have here one last slide. Pam Grossman, she wrote a book called Waking the Witch. If you can buy it online and on Amazon, she actually calls herself a witch. She thinks of herself as the good witch. She, has a job. She's a full-fledged human being. She has a family. She's married. And she says, look, I want you to see me as a real person and not as a crazy woman. And she writes that, yes, witches can be dangerous, but they can also be divine, and they can also live on their own terms and live with their own agency, and they can, create and be freer. And so she claims that the witch is really the ultimate feminist icon, because she's, the sort of a symbol of somebody who's kind of stripping away power and trying to find power in other places. So I'm hoping that, and this is my last comment before I spend a little time now taking some more questions from you, but I'm going to end with this, that I just happened to be reading the New York Times this past weekend, and there was an article about different religious traditions. They're joining Protestant and Catholic schools and people from other faiths in elementary school so that they can learn together rather than apart. It used to be that the Catholic children would learn separately from the Protestant children, and now they want to kind of create a unification between all of them. And so in prayer in the morning, they all have to say, "We are different and special together." And I just thought, oh, that's really beautiful. It's a really nice way of, sort of like thinking about the fact that we all defy categories, and we just have to be, respectful of the ways in which we defy them ourselves and the ways in which we look at others who want to defy those categories also. Okay, so I'm stopping my share, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody who still has them, or comments, or.
Great, thank you. Okay. Someone asked a little while back about wondering if there's a larger connection to Rav Nachman and his family. I think that you have taught us in this context before, this forum before, about Yalta, who Rav Nachman was married to. I know that you've taught about her in a lot of other places. And, if we think of her as kind of, this person described her as a force of feminism, or she certainly kind of stood out from the rest of the women of her time in learning and authority. So someone was asking, is the story potentially an attempt to kind of slander the women in that family because, they're not behaving as women should?
It's such a great question. It all is in how you read it. And you could read it as slander, or like I was trying to read it, you could read it the opposite way. And we know about Rav Nachman that many women brought legal cases before Rav Nachman, women who were being, had issues with property, inheritance issues, and he very often sided with women. And so I'm not sure that this is all about us slandering him, although he doesn't rise to the surface as coming out to be such a great guy here. But I don't think that this is slander per se, but I think rather I'd like to think that, somebody who may have had Yalta in their midst. And I'm not sure 100% whether Yalta was married to him or not. She might have just been sitting at his table and learning from him. It's unclear, but let's say she was his wife. She's a very learned wife. So he was always kind of pushing the boundaries, I think. And so I don't think that it's so, unheard of to think of the fact that Rav Nachman's daughters were somehow different. And we're defying categories, just like Yalta, his wife, might have been defying categories. And so I don't necessarily see it as much as slander, but as a way to kind of, say there are other options for, I don't want to, maybe not other options, but like women came in all different, there are different ways in which women can appear in Talmudic life, in rabbinic life. And it's not only just the stereotypical view that we should cater to. And again, I will repeat that these women, they go back home and they're like witchcraft. Yes, it sounds very negative and it sounds slanderous, but on the other hand, if it really was slander, then they would have been stoned and they weren't. So I don't know, there's something there.
Okay, great, thanks. I think the point of the question was less about the slander and more about, as someone just mentioned, Bruria. Anyway, more about the connection to Yalta. But you
Yalta, yes.
Okay, so there were some interesting comments related to the verse from Ecclesiastes that kind of gets this whole thing rolling. So one person commented a while back, not too surprising that that these rabbis can't find any wise women because they didn't really interact with women very much, it seems, and they're not educated and supported in their intellectual development or communal leadership, etc. So it's a little bit self-fulfilling or a tautology or something like that. But then someone, so kind of related to that, someone wrote that they're reading the end of the story as a vindication of, or maybe a response to that charge, of not being able to find righteous, wise women. This person wrote, it was challenged by the example of Rav Nachman's daughters, but the rabbis can't be wrong, so the story must force the women to be seen as not righteous, meaning they were examples of such, wise women or righteous women as alluded to in the verse, but we're not. We need to somehow make them bad. I guess this person is saying, because we're threatened by their
greatness or something.
Something about They're sort of something about them that's different from other women, intelligence, something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I actually don't, I think it goes back to the way in which there are many readings of this story, and I don't want to come away with only one reading. And I think there are a lot of ways to read it. And I think it can end up as a way of controlling these women by labeling them as witches. Maybe they were in Rav Nachman's household, and so maybe they knew and were smarter and had more knowledge than others, and that was dangerous to some, and so they're trying to control them in some way by ending the story with them being sorceresses, maybe. But I also think that one of the dangers that we run into, and this is what I'm always trying to teach my students, is to stay away from the stereotypes, because very often we think that women were, of course they were in the kitchen and they didn't know anything and they didn't have any knowledge of halakha and they didn't study and they weren't in the Beit Midrash. But it's not really true, because they leave us with instances and examples of Bruria and Yalta and all sorts of others, as well as, these women, these Rav Nachman's daughters. I mean, they leave us with examples that the stereotype that we think of women is not, it's not the case. So I just think we have to kind of look for each individual example and take each one at its face value and try not to over stereotype. I think that verse is a stereotype that I think this story is trying to challenge. But Whether it does it successfully or not, I'm not sure, but I do think it's trying to challenge that verse. At a simplistic read, if you get to the end and you see them as having been turned into witches, and you see that as a completely negative description of them, then I think that maybe you read it as they prove the verse, but I'm not reading it that way. Anyway.
So there were some thoughts related to contemporary issues and sexual orientation and gender identity. So one person asked, how do you relate this to the modern trend of young people rejecting their genders, meaning those assigned at birth, and wanting to be free from the frameworks of how we see gender and identity? And I was actually thinking about, so I'm definitely curious to hear what you have to say about that. And I was thinking of something more specific, even. It's kind of prompted by some of the secondary sources you were sharing, about kind of the really terrible conflation of people who are gay, or especially men, with child abuse. That I think used to happen a lot before homosexuality was more normalized in society, but there's still, we still hear that a lot. It's like a trope on the political right. So, right, there's sort of a type of person who's normal as we see it, but in an attempt to control or out of fear or some of the other forces you were talking about, we want to put them into a more disturbing or threatening kind of box and cast them that way. I was wondering if you see any parallel there. And then again, there was kind of the broader question about, or a different question really about gender identity.
I think that I think you went two different ways in that question. The first half, if I'm understanding you correctly, the first half was, I think, do I see the idea of choosing to be a witch or choosing to align oneself with witchery, and it's that self-identification, which is freeing. Is it a way for people who are either non-binary or who are queer, to find themselves? Is that what you were trying to say? Like it was.
They were two separate questions, and it probably was more confusing than I tried to put them together. The question was more about, I talk about this honestly with my friends all the time, given the age of our kids. It's like so many kids these days are the idea of, right, there's the idea is, gender is inherently defined by the patriarchy, and I want to transcend gender, and I'm going to be a they. I definitely know, a lot of folks in their teens and early 20s who, were girls, did not seem to feel that they were boys, but now are going by they, to kind of transcend the category of gender. So I think that's what the person was talking about, and she didn't relate it directly to something in the story.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to respond to that, because I'm not sure I see that happening in this particular story, where I think that what's parallel is you have, I think, a group of women who are uncomfortable with a prior designation or a prior square box that they've been placed into, and that they want to be who they are, whatever that means. They happen to get taken captive, and for some reason in captivity feel freer about who they are than they did when they were living in Rav Nachman's space. And so rather than keeping them in captivity or erasing them, they bring them back into the fold in some kind of way that makes them defy category. And the Gemara seems to want to include that. Yes, there were these daughters of the famous Rav Nachman, married to the great Yalta, very knowledgeable Torah scholar, who in fact came back to their homes, return to their husbands, but but are acknowledged as who they really are. So that's how I would read it, as sort of a queer story. And I thank you, whoever put that out there. I hadn't actually thought about it that way until they said it. And so I feel like it's a really interesting way of reading the story. So thank you.
I definitely had not thought about it that way either. And did you have a comment on, the other, sort of disturbing matter of conflating homosexuality with molestation of children? I'm sorry to raise.
Yeah, I just don't see where that.
People.
Yeah, I just don't see, because we don't have really children per se here. I mean, I guess we have the daughters.
No, not that they're children in the story, but right, we have women, and then the question is, are they in this other scary category of witches, and sort of the various reasons, again, as you cited in the secondary sources, for wanting to control them through those negative characterizations. That was the analogy I was thinking about.
Yeah. I kind of want to hold back on that. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I can see that with like Salem. So basically, what do? They take these women and they are afraid of them, or they want to have more control in a very patriarchal kind of society. And once you get a pastor who can speak vehemently against a certain group of people, it sort of revs up, all the other people to follow suit. And I guess, those labels are, very, very they're very dangerous, for sure. But I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, because I'm just not getting to the parallel of the, the abused child case from this story. But
that's fine. We can leave it behind.
I have to think about it.
Okay. On a sort of smaller, or more straightforward level, a number of people brought up the fact that Rav Nachman's daughters aren't named in the story. And I hadn't mentioned it before, even though a lot of people asked it, because it's so standard for rabbinic stories, but people are still asking about it. So do you want to comment?
I find it agreed. I mean, there's this gendered stereotype in a way. Well, they're less important. They're not named. And so therefore they're in this kind of like space of being less important. If they were Rav Nachman's sons, they would have names, right? It would say, X Ben, Rav Nachman, blah, 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 blah. And so you would have that. And then, so these women just don't, they don't have persona, and they're grouped together. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, part of the problem is that they're just grouped together doing something that women do, which is cook. And but then they wind up being very othered. Now, whether they're being othered and being classified as so distinct here is because they're being slandered, or because they're being freed from something and given some kind of characterization so that they can rise beyond the fact that they're unnamed. I'm not sure, but I think it's so curious for sure. And clearly they're women, so they're unnamed, but I mean, there are women who are named. Yalta's named, Buria's named, just not as frequently as, the men are.
Right. And
they're not rabbis. So that's another issue. So that could be why they're not named, but.
Right. We also have someone just noted that the man who talks to birds also is or
not
understands
birds. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is, I know we're nearing the end of our time, but I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit, but someone was suggesting is, do you think that there's some kind of run-of-the-mill anxiety about by men of sort of being able to keep control over their wives? Just sort of a more basic thing going on here.
I would say 100%. I think that there were men who were very fearful that these women would be taken into captivity. And when they came back, right, then these women may not have wanted to come back to them, or, may have, I don't know, viewed them as less in some ways. I mean, I think that there's certainly an insecurity that men have, and they would like to have control over control over their of their wives more so. And this issue of captivity meant that they didn't have total control, which is problematic.
Right.
So, but anyway.
So I just wanted to, again, this is at this point off topic, but I just wanted to clarify what I was saying earlier, because we had a comment from someone who was trans that I was not characterizing all trans folks in what we kind of some of the trends that we were talking about with young people and wanting to transcend gender and go by they. That was not remotely in any way, shape, or form a characterization of all trans folks. So it's a much bigger topic, and I'm happy to continue further separately, but I just wanted to make sure we said that. I think you had, so we're just about at the end, but I think you wanted to go back to the idea that came up. We asked a question earlier about, oh gosh, it was so long ago, but I think sort of the ultimate, here, I'll reread it. Is it possible that the story about witches is about being witches is a creative means for the sages to enable the women to go back to their Jewish husbands and be accepted, versus going back and being rejected for presumed adultery? So it's sort of like a rescuing device almost for their being able to rejoin society. I think that was the one that we wanted to come back to.
Yeah, and it could very well be that, right, that they rejoin the society, but they rejoin society in their own individualist way. I mean, again, it all depends on how you read it, whether they're rejoining society as labeled as witches, which is negative, or they're rejoining society as some kind of women with special powers who, are, freed from some past, definition of who they were, unclear. But
Yeah.
But anyway, I really want to thank everybody for being such great participants and for all the questions. I've been taking notes, and one day I'll write this up, and I will definitely have a lot of your thoughts in my mind as I write it. I think that you really, we didn't even get back to the Macbeth and the stirring the pot, and just I love the literary imagery of women who stir the pot and the gossiping, and I don't know, you all picked up on a lot of great themes, and so I just want to thank you for just being a really attentive and really great audience, and it's been a really enjoyable afternoon. So thank you very much. And thanks to Rabbi Andelman, and that's a hard thing to do, is to field all those questions.
So there are many more questions that I will send you, because we barely scratched the surface. The thing that you just, the individualism theme, many comments there. So thank you so much for bringing us this, really interesting text. And I think, going back to, some of the themes you've raised, not to assume things that aren't there, to kind of have some open-ended ways of reading the text that allows people to be who they are. I think that's, not to sort of put people on the margins, assume they're on the margins, where the text may or may not be doing that. So thank you for just such an interesting session, and as evidenced by the flood of of comments that I will send you. It's been an interesting lens on the question of the series about sort of living on the margins and thresholds between different kinds, boundaries between different sorts of things. So thank you once again. And next week, just want to let people know, Dr. Alan Cooper, one of our Bible professors, will be teaching us on the blasphemer in Leviticus, a marginal figure. So that is next week, April 24th. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much again to Dr. Lehman, and we look forward to learning again with you soon.